Hello, welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm just going to keep an eye on the numbers as participants start coming in. It always takes a few minutes and then I will start. But welcome, we will be starting very shortly. People are anything like me, they're scrabbling around trying to find the login details. I am very bad at losing login details for meetings. Hello, welcome to those who are just joining us. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes just to allow everybody to get in. I can see the numbers going up as I speak. So that's good. Welcome. Give it one more minute and then I'll start. Till 2 minutes past and then I'll start. Hello, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Mary-Ann Stevenson. I'm the director of the UK Women's Budget Group and welcome to this meeting on women, COVID and social security. This is one of the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be holding, looking at different aspects of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women. Earlier in the year, we published a series of reports predicting what we thought the likely impacts were going to be based on what we knew prior to the pandemic about the situation of women. We now have a lot more information about what's actually happening, and sadly, we were right. The pandemic has not only exposed but also exacerbated many of the pre-existing inequalities that exist in the UK, not just gendered inequalities, but inequalities based particularly on race and class and disability. And we're seeing that not least within the social security system, which is failing to provide support for people when they need it most. And this is part of longer term problems with the social security. As Fran is always reminding me, social security is not just a safety net, it's actually a mechanism for promoting greater equality. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're really fortunate to have a great panel with us, and we've divided the session into 3 parts. So the first part is looking at the problems within the social security system for women, particularly at the moment. And we're going to hear from Fran Bennet, from Fazilet Hadi, from Disability Rights UK, and from Kimberly Macintosh from Child Poverty Action Group. Fran, sorry, I should have said, is from the University of Oxford and also a member of the Women's Budget Group. After them, we're going to hear from Lucy Bannister from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Carl Hanscom from the Resolution Foundation about some of their proposals about what we should do to improve the situation. And then we've got time for questions and discussion. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. You can use the chat to introduce yourselves, to post links to any reports or briefings that you think might be useful, and we might be posting links at the same time, and generally to take part in the discussion. This event will be recorded and we're going to be putting it on our website for those people who couldn't tear themselves away from the news channels watching the results from America, which I know most of us are finding gripping and anxiety provoking in equal measure. So thank you very much to those of you who've joined us today. And I would like to first of all kick off with Fran, who's going to be looking at both individual and the issues about the individual and the household, and getting beyond the black box of the household when we think about the social security system. So, Fran Bennet, over to you.
Thanks very much, Marianne. I'm talking with two hats on really today. One is as a co-author of a paper with Marilyn Howard, which has not yet been published, but we hope the Women's Budget Group will publish it, which is a research briefing on money within the household. And also I'm part of a research team on universal credit and couples led by Professor Jane Miller at the University of Bath. I should also say I'm on the advisory group for Welfare at a Social Distance, which is looking at social security in the time of COVID, and I'll be looking at what they say as well. So the first issue I think that the pandemic has revealed is our reliance in the UK on jointly assessed means-tested benefits in our social security system. Now, we do still have some individually based benefits. You'll know them. They're contributory or new style, job seekers allowance and employment and support allowance, and also the non-contributory carers allowance. Those are the main ones. But they've been eroded over time. They didn't get the uplift that universal credit and working tax credit got. And there was no real reference to them when there was a discussion about the social protection and social security measures in relation to COVID. So some people may have missed out on claiming benefits that they could actually be entitled to, particularly women. For example, contributory job seekers allowance when they lost their jobs. And that means that some people would have lost any source of independent income within the household. So that's the first point. The second point is they're therefore more likely to have claimed universal credit. And because that's a joint means test for couples, many people have been excluded from that because either they or their partner have still got earnings, or because they've got savings which are too high to qualify for universal credit. You used to be able to get tax credits with savings, but if you've got more than 16,000, you can't get universal credit. So nearly half of those that Welfare at a Social Distance found were ineligible for universal credit were ineligible because of partners' earnings or their own earnings, and nearly a quarter were ineligible because of the joint means test for capital or their own capital. So, for example, they might be saving for a deposit on a house, and that might exclude them. Welfare at a Social Distance also found that 2/3 who only tried to claim universal credit hadn't even considered applying for new style job seekers allowance or employment and support allowance. So that's one issue, is about the joint means test and the reliance on means tested benefits in our system. Another issue, which is raised in the paper with Marilyn and is explored in the Universal Credit and Couples research that we've been doing, is distribution within the household. So universal credit raises the issue of distribution of income within the household because there's only one payment for the vast majority of couples. In other words, it goes to one account. So in relation to this, Women's Budget Group have raised the issue of domestic abuse, both in terms of financial coercion and in terms of the inability to lay hands on any money if you're a survivor trying to leave the household. The government's answer to this, and we also found this in our universal credit and couples research, is that more women than men get the universal credit payment. But that raises another issue, and it doesn't solve the problem because it raises the issue of the distribution of responsibilities within the household. It also raises, of course, the fact that this is not really independent income because it's jointly means tested. Any income you get, even if you get the whole universal credit payment, actually depends on your partner being there, depends on your partner's action, and it depends on your partner's resources if you're in a couple. And part of the reason why many women get the universal credit payment is because of their greater responsibility for making money stretch in low-income households, particularly with children. The shock absorbers of household poverty, as Ruth Lister called it in a Women's Budget Group document some time ago. So the other impact of COVID is that this task, which is primarily taken on by women often in low-income households with children, of managing the day-to-day household budget has become increasingly onerous.
1 minute,
It's
Fran.
exacerbated by the failure to provide any additional resources for children, apart from the free school meals in the summer. So, for example, the universal credit uplift is the same amount, whether you're single or a couple or you've got several children. And of course, children have been at home more, and costs have risen, therefore, for example, in terms of heating or in terms of the food that you've got to give them. And our universal credit and couples research showed that women were more likely to take on the administration of the universal credit claim as well, especially if they were the ones at home with children. So, to finish off with, our concern is not just with the gendered distribution of resources within the household, as well as obviously more generally within society, but also with the gender distribution of responsibilities, in other words, what we call the division of labour. So therefore, when we look at the future of social security and we're considering the introduction of policies or their assessment, we need to include not just the snapshot of the impact on household income, but also the impact on individual access to income. And that includes, by the way, child benefit for the children that you are looking after. And we need to look at the distribution of responsibilities between men and women, not just now, but over the life course as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran, and thank you for getting so much information into such a short space of time. I'm now going to hand over to Fazilet Hadi from Disability Rights UK, who's going to talk particularly about the impact of COVID on disabled women and social security.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. I'm going to just start by saying that according to Joseph Rowntree, who we're going to hear from later, half the people in poverty, 7 million people, are either disabled themselves or have a household member with a disability. And when we look at disabled women, nearly half of disabled women are either not at work or not looking for work. And for many disabled women in work, the disability pay gap is nearly 20% less for them. So you can see disabled women are very, very exposed to what we consider to be a very, very unfair social security system. I'm going to run through why we think it's so unfair, and I really probably don't have a good word to say about it. So firstly, the purpose of the system, it's good to hear that it should be more than a safety net, and possibly it should be a springboard to a decent life, but it isn't. And what it feels like is punitive and sanctions driven. It feels like disabled people are supplicants to the system. They're not there to benefit from it. They're there to be put under its scrutiny. The system isn't inclusively designed in any way. It isn't co-produced. It isn't built on the social model of disability, which asks that society changes to acknowledge that 20% of us are disabled. In terms of the level of benefits, disabled people often have, in real terms, lower incomes, and we have additional costs. Scope estimates those additional costs to be approximately over £500 a month, but I'm sure we could argue about that. But it is more costly to live as a disabled person. And the benefit system doesn't fully recognise that, although there are some additional cost benefits. Also, in the last 6 months, we've seen, as Fran mentioned, such a brutal unfairness with universal credit being uplifted by £20. I mean, that just points to the inadequacy of universal credit payments anyway, but other legacy benefits like employment support allowance didn't receive that uplift. How can that be justified? It's totally unacceptable and discriminatory. And we must remember that in 2017, £30 a week was taken away from claimants who were affected by restrictions in their ability to work. £30 a week is an awful amount, a lot of money, and it hasn't been restored either to people on employment support allowances that claimed after 2017, April 2017, or to the equivalent people on universal credit. If you lose your job in this crisis and you get working tax credit, you won't get transitional protection when you move to universal credit, and that will disadvantage many people, including disabled people. And we still have these artificial limits to benefits, like the benefits cap, the 2-child rule, etc. So it's really not a happy picture in terms of level of benefits. In terms of process, we find a lot of assessors don't understand disability at all, are quite ignorant and sometimes quite harsh and cruel. We find that the processes aren't personalised, whether that's digital or telephone or face-to-face. There's not enough thought about the person and what they need. And we find the payment process is harsh, with people not getting payments for many weeks, no grants for one-off expenditures. Yeah, a very poor system in terms of process on all levels. Couple of final points. First is on safeguarding. There's been quite a few letters to and fro and evidence to the Work and Pensions Select Committee around the fact that apparently the Department of Work and Pensions doesn't think it's got a duty to safeguard its vulnerable claimants. It thinks other people have that duty, but not it. And of course, that's become particularly pertinent due to the number of benefit-related deaths that we've seen. And then my final point is really around the way the social security system interacts with getting people into work. So we've seen government announcements recently about new work programmes, and neither of the announcements has made any additional provision for disabled young people or disabled adults. And we know that from the Citizens Advice Bureau report and from other sources that disabled people are being hit very, very badly by the economic recession that's following the COVID crisis. And even in the recruitment of new job centre work coaches, we see no recognition that people need disability expertise. So yeah, not a happy picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fazilet. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm now going to go to Kimberly Macintosh from the Child Poverty Action Group. Kim.
Thanks, Marianne. So I'm going to talk very quickly about 3 aspects of the social security system and the interaction of race and gender and how it disproportionately impacts people with intersecting inequalities. I'm going to talk about the benefit cap, 2-child limit, no recourse to public funds, and if there's time, the impact of the lockdown on parents and carers' mental health. But we'll see how we go. So I think the first thing to say is that long-standing inequalities between white people and BME people, women and men, and particularly people with intersecting identities have existed for a long time. And so what we're seeing is this exacerbation of what already exists, and then this disproportionate impact, particularly on BME women. And if we look at the benefit cap, we already knew that disproportionately hit BME families before COVID hit. That was true from the government's own equality impact assessment in 2012, as well as research that the Women's Budget Group did with the Runnymede Trust. We know that it hits lone parents harder, and that women are much more likely to be the head of a lone family, about 91%. And we also know that Black women are twice as likely to be lone parents, and that BME families are more likely to live in London, where rents are higher. So since February until May, we've seen the number of households affected by the benefit cap almost double, from 79,000 households to 154,000 households. And of those households, the vast majority are families with children, over 80%, and most of those are single parent families, to 62%. And that's likely to be higher now because of the increase in job losses that we've seen, with more to come. And there are a couple of reasons for this increase. The uprating of the standard allowance in universal credit by £20, and the increase of local housing allowance rates to the 30th percentile. was been put in place to help families with the increased costs of COVID, having children in the home, the increase in job losses. But this has also pushed some families into the benefit cap, which has actually reduced the amount of support that they've received. Equally, families who have lost hours are now no longer exempt from the benefit cap. So maybe they're no longer working 16 hours a week, or they're not meeting the earnings threshold. And again, now they're subject to the cap and they're worse off. There is a grace period, but that does depend on having consistent earnings. So people who are in insecure work, it's much more difficult for them to meet those conditions. And there are also people who are engaging with the social security system for the first time because of the COVID crisis, who are now seeing themselves subjected to the benefit cap. We're seeing similar potential disproportionalities for BME families with the 2-child limit as well. So we know that the 2-child limit before COVID disproportionately impacted BME families. And a recent report that we did with the Church of England found that an additional 60,000 families could be affected by the 2-child limit because of the COVID-19 crisis. So the rationale for this policy is that families that claim benefits need to be held to the same standard to make the same choices about family planning as people who solely earn their income through work, which is clearly illogical, and even more so now because of the COVID crisis. Families' financial situation has never been static, but with COVID, we know even more so that there's an uncertainty. You don't know necessarily when crisis will hit, when you'll see a financial change. And we're seeing that come through in case studies through our briefings and reports. So one family said, now that I've lost my job, I don't have my own money, and so I've had to go on universal credit. Now I'm being punished for being a mother who has always worked, who's going through a hard time, and being made to choose between food or school, shoes, food or electricity, packed lunches for school or gas, nappies or sanitary products. And bearing in mind that we know that 1 in 5 BME workers who were furloughed during the first lockdown have since lost their jobs, we can expect to see more disproportionality coming through for BME families and for women as well. The families with no recourse to public funds haven't been able to access COVID support that is accessed through the social security system. Although they're required to pay taxes, they're not permitted to access the same safety net that those taxes fund. And we've been seeing coming through our early warning system, where we collect case studies on the impacts of social security changes on families, that no recourse to public fund conditions are really affecting families and pushing them into much more difficult situations. So one couple who have no recourse to public funds are struggling to make ends meet for themselves and their 2 children. The father was working, but that has ended due to COVID, and now they have no money and are reliant on food banks. Another lone parent who had an NRPF condition has been working at university while she studies, is now no longer able to work, currently has no income at all, but is also not eligible to claim benefits. And finally, we've been seeing the financial impact of having children at home during the lockdown, which was mentioned earlier, the increased financial cost during the first lockdown, but also the stress of having to juggle work and childcare has had an impact on the mental health of parents and carers. So we've done some research in Wales, which saw parents reporting feelings of stress and guilt whilst they're trying to juggle increased responsibilities at work, adjusting to home working, but having in relation to that, then having less resource and less time to support their children with home working, and feeling a sense that they were failing on both counts. So one mother from Wales said, as we both work full time, this has been very difficult for us. Both children have been very reluctant to do their work, and it has made me feel very guilty for not having the time to spend teaching them. This is the mother of 2 teenagers. Another mother reported that we both work from home, but she has had to rearrange her workday to sit and supervise and support her child. Our cost of learning and lockdown report also had case studies coming through, documenting the experiences of families during the first lockdown. And these are predominantly the experiences of women. In our parents and carers survey, over 90% of the people who responded were women, and we've seen through the real-time surveys that have been put out during the first lockdown, that again and again, it was women that were taking on the responsibility of home learning, and the ones that were having to readjust their working day around the needs of their children being in the home. So to finish, what we've seen is that COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities that already exist across income level, across protected characteristics, and it's made it even clearer the changes that need to be made to social security and brought into sharper focus the problems and inconsistencies that have existed for a long time, and that the case for reform has never been more clear or more urgent.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all the Fran and Fazilet so far, who've really set out the stark situation that we're in and the failures of a social security system, both in terms of levels of generosity or lack of generosity, in terms of restrictions on who's able to claim benefits, and in terms of the way the system itself is organized, the structure of the system, and the longer term problems that causes. So what we're now going to hear is some proposals for what needs to happen next. And first of all, Lucy Bannister from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is going to talk about the Keep the Lifeline campaign, which is about maintaining the uplift in universal credit. I'm sure she may well say some things about other things as well. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Yes, so I'm Lucy Bannister and I am a Policy Campaigns Manager at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, focusing on our social security work. And I've been heading up our Keep the Lifeline campaign. The campaign is calling the government to make permanent the £20 uplift to universal credit and working tax credit that was introduced at the start of this pandemic. And of course, for them to also extend an equivalent lifeline to those on legacy benefits who others have mentioned have so far been really unfairly left behind. What's been really great about this campaign throughout the entire time is the wide range of support that we've had. Pretty much every organisation, even on this panel, and many of the organisations that popped up in the chat have been people who have got on board with this campaign so far. And I think the reason for that widespread support is partly because of how wide-ranging the impact is, but also because of how significant this uplift was. So after years of erosion to the levels of social security due to the benefit freeze and cuts, this uplift was such a significant boost to the adequacy of the system. Before April, someone who was finding themselves outside of work due to redundancy or a contract ending or whatever, they would have found that the support available was at its lowest level since 1990 in real terms, and its lowest ever as a proportion of average earnings. So that meant that for so many families, the social support system was just completely inadequate. And it was significant to see a Conservative government recognise that and invest this level into the system. We have fought long and hard for investments of much smaller amounts before. And so what that meant is that we've really changed the landscape. What's really important to know, however, is that even with that uplift, a family who finds themselves outside of work will still receive £1,600 less per year than they would have done in 2011. And for families with children, that goes up to £2,900 less a year than they would in 2011. And of course, I'm sure this was reflected in the hardship that we've all seen families facing. And of course, the amount in the standard allowances of universal credit is definitely not the be all and end all. Many other speakers here today have mentioned the huge number of other issues with the system. But what I want to kind of stress is the reason that we focused on this rather than any others, and why so many other organisations and sectors have done this, is because we needed to make sure that this investment was maintained beyond April. So if this cut, so this uplift is only in place until April 2021, and if that ended then, what we would see is 16 million people being in households that faced a cut overnight to their income of over £1,000. It would cause 700,000 people to be pulled into poverty. and 500,000 people pulled into deep poverty, which we are defining at the moment as people who are over 50% below the poverty line, so at serious risk of destitution. So a really positive development in the campaign over the last few weeks is that the Chancellor has said that he is open to the idea of extending the uplift beyond April, depending on where we are in spring. So good news in many ways. I mean, there's a couple of concerns to that. Firstly, if that means that they're still insisting that this is a temporary uplift. They're just going to see where we are with the pandemic, and if it's still there, then extend it. There's still a lack of recognition that this was a much needed boost to social security adequacy generally. But crucially, it massively diminishes the chances of legacy benefits being included this time round. As Fazilet highlighted quite so rightly, this uplift was only for universal credit and working tax credit. Legacy benefits such as ESA, JSA and income support were so unfairly not included. The majority of families on legacy benefits are disabled, sick, carers. That means that they were in families that were much more likely to be in poverty before the pandemic. They've been at particular risk during the pandemic and have faced many additional costs. And looking ahead at the recovery, they're likely to face, unfortunately, particular disadvantage in a contracted labour market. So that's why so many charities have been calling out this injustice over the last few months, but sadly they've been so widely ignored. There's been a few excuses that have been pushed around, but one key one is the length of time that it takes DWP to implement changes to the legacy benefit system. They're on an older computer system, and so the DWP say they're not able to make the changes as quickly as they would to universal credit. And that's also why in November every year, the benefit uprating process takes place, so a few months ahead of April. That gives DWP the time in which to implement the changes to their systems. So by the Chancellor insisting that he's not going to make this decision until spring, that means that there's not going to be the time again, if we wait till then, for legacy benefits to be uplifted. So we are really crucially pushing over the next few weeks the importance of November, urging the Chancellor to make this decision now, so that first of all to give families a certainty over the winter that they're not going to face another income cut, but also to ensure that legacy benefits are included. So really keen to hear from anyone who would like to get involved with the campaign. We send a weekly update about the campaign. Lots of ways to get involved. If you have links to people with lived experience, for example, write to your MP, petitions. Yeah, do get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I really like the fact that you talked about social security as an investment. And, you know, it reminds me of the Social Security Scotland Act, which starts off with a recognition that social security is an investment in the people of Scotland, and moving away from that idea that this is about the kind of scroungers and strivers narrative that we've had so much of over the 10 years. This is actually about an investment in the well-being of the people of this country. So last but by no means least, we're going to hear from Carl Hanscom from the Resolution Foundation. Like many of you here, I'm sure I rely on the Resolution Foundation's charts more than is probably a sign of my sanity. And certainly I spend a lot of time on Twitter trying to kind of get into the charts and see what they're showing. So really looking forward to hearing what Carl's got to say about the Resolution Foundation's work on universal credit. Carl.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Carl Hanscom. I work as a senior economist at the Resolution Foundation with a particular focus on welfare. And firstly, it's great to hear from all the other panelists, but that does put me in a difficult position because they've already covered sort of so many interesting topics that there's less for me to speak about, but I will try my best. Before we jump into some of the things we've looked at specifically that the government could look at during this coronavirus period that would help families on benefits, I just want to reflect back on what Fran was saying at the very beginning about how we have this household benefit system and what that entails. And you can think of the benefit system as providing a safety net, but it's also there as more of a cushion as well when people and families find themselves falling out of work under hard times, as we're seeing millions of households today happen to themselves. And so some of our earlier work in the crisis looked at the replacement rate. So that's how much of your income is protected as you fall out of work. And if you compare the universal credit, the median replacement rate for a household when they fall out of work goes down to something like 53%. Now, if you compare that to the job retention scheme, where once you take into account taxes, that means you're actually around 90% replacement rate. That's a huge gap. And I think, by its own admission, by introducing the job retention scheme, the self-employment support scheme, the government has said the welfare system is, it's not sufficient enough to provide income to support for the majority of people living in this country during the coronavirus pandemic. That should be a bit of a wake-up bell to say maybe we need to look at welfare system. And on the one side, the level of the safety net and also the amount of cushioning it can do. And an area that, as Fran mentioned, has gone quite undiscussed is around what role contributory benefits can have there. And if you bring the welfare system into more of a cohesive nature, where it's not just acting as that safety net, but it's also there as that insurance system for people who fall out of work. It's possible to have a welfare system that does work for all, that is balanced, and yes, it can be affordable at the same time, and that can get more buy-in from the general public. And I think that's really important to consider. Another reflection is that recently there was a British Social Attitude Survey Wave released, and in that I think we saw that people were actually, on balance, they believed that benefits were too stingy, if you like, and that the generosity become too low over the lot. And I think that's the highest portion of people saying that in about 12 years. And that just tells you surely now is the time for the government to really look at the welfare system. And that most people in the general public recognise that it's just not enough to survive on. So returning back to the replacement rates, some interesting facts pulled from there is that by the nature of the welfare system, it does provide extra support to single parents and with children, and also parents with children, through child premiums to universal credit, and also the housing element of universal credit, which means that we find that there's a median replacement rate for single parents around 73%, so much higher than the 50%. But too often we think about things in terms of averages or medians. Actually, if you look at the range around that, there's a huge range of single parents who will be facing a replacement rate well down to 50%. And if you've already got committed housing costs, you've got committed spending on other things such as a car or loan or other debt repayments, facing an income shock of that magnitude can be really significant. And part of the reason we see that variation in how much replacement rate you're likely to get, and in particular for single parents, is because of the policies that have already been mentioned by Kimberly, the benefit cap. And also, if you consider the local housing allowance is capped at 30% of your local rents. So if you're unlucky enough in this crisis to have suddenly been lost your job and you're finding it difficult to find a new one, and you happen to live in just average housing for your area, by default, when you claim universal credit, if you're a renter, you're going to be facing a shortfall. And so this is why some of our recommendations have focused on the benefit cap for starters, means that many people haven't experienced that £20 uplift to help them with any additional costs during coronavirus. But at the same time, as the 9-month grace period comes to an end, you're going to see potentially thousands more families having their benefits reduced right at the time when we're going into a second lockdown. It makes completely no sense. And also just to consider renters as well during this crisis. The way the benefit system is structured is like you either have to get back into work quite quickly if you're living in reasonably or even average cost housing, or you will have to effectively downsize or squeeze and find some cheaper accommodation. Asking people to look for a new house during this coronavirus pandemic and deal with that cut in their income just doesn't seem fair to me, and also doesn't seem right. It's not the kind of behaviour you want to be encouraging during this health pandemic. And then finally, it's something that, again, has already been mentioned, but the capital test. The capital test is there because the government doesn't want to see the welfare system as supporting people who can support themselves. But that makes absolutely zero sense, because right now how can you support yourself when vacancies are running at around 50% what they are pre-crisis? It's not easy to move back into work when people are furloughed left, right, and centre, and also businesses just aren't hiring. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you for raising those other points about renters in particular. And I think one of the, we need to think about the interaction, particularly with the local housing allowance rates, which is one of the main reasons why the social security system is failing so many people, because the allowance for rent is so inadequate. Even now, it's the link with rents has been restored, albeit at a 30% rather than average rents kind of way. So we have about 20 minutes left for questions and discussion. If anybody in the audience would like to post a question in the Q&A box, I can read them out to the panel. We haven't got any questions in there just yet, but I'm sure that's because everybody's been so busy listening to the panelists that they haven't had time to start typing. While we're waiting for those questions to come up, I suppose one of the things that I was going to ask the panelists was, other than the issues around the uplift in local housing allowance and removal of no recourse and the keeping the uplift that Lucy talked about, do people have initial thoughts about what should be happening now? Because obviously there's a short-term question with COVID, and then possible thoughts about longer-term issues. Fran.
I think I'm unmuted. Just to say that I should probably have said more about child benefit, but what that raises is the issue of the general uprating of benefits, which certainly is coming up, as Lucy talked about. And although the government, we're grateful that the government lifted the 4-year freeze on most working age benefits this year, they were uprated by 1.7%, if memory serves me right. Of course, that didn't do anything about making good any of the loss of value that there has been over the 4 years of freeze. And child benefit in particular, I think I'm right in saying, Kim, that CPAG says it's lost nearly a quarter of its real value over the past few years. And child benefit is particularly important and particularly crucial in COVID time, because it's actually simple, well understood. It follows the child through changes in jobs and changes in family status and changes in housing and everything. And it's actually the easiest way for the government to get additional resources to families with children who have, as I was saying, lost out in terms of the balance of additional help that's been given during COVID through the social security system. So I suppose I'm saying two things. One is that we should look at the general uplift in benefits and try to persuade the government to make good some of the previous cuts in value. And we should also be saying in particular that child benefit is a very easy in terms of administrative ease benefit to get this help to children that has been missing in the government's response to COVID so far.
Thank you, Fran. Anybody else want to say anything on child benefit in particular? We've had a couple of questions come in, which I'll go to in a second, but anybody else got any comments on child benefit? Kim?
I'll just quickly add that we've been calling for some time for a £10 increase to child benefit as a way to easy to administer, direct to families, and we've not seen that support for families with children during COVID, and that would be a quick, easy way to remedy that.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we've also, before the pandemic struck, our kind of focus was on families with children and child poverty, particularly looking at families with very young children who often kind of come up with particularly high levels of poverty. We were instead looking at the child element rather than child benefit, which is something that comes up, sort of pros and cons for both. but we also kind of recognise that's a kind of key area of focus for we're seeing it as one for after this current decision-making period.
Okay, thank you. We've had some questions in. So the first is from Siobhan Harding. I'll do questions in groups of 3, I think. What are your thoughts about mitigations? We have mitigations for the benefit cap and the bedroom tax in Northern Ireland, which helps. And the government have committed to extend and possibly strengthen, presumably these mitigations to take account of the 2-child limit universal credit, but that has not been agreed yet. They're looking at it. So this is Northern Ireland. And then one from Marilyn Howard, I think, talking about legacy benefits seems to downgrade non-means tested benefits like employment support allowance and job seekers allowance, which are benefits in their own right. Is it now, as someone has written, the time for a new beverage? And then a question in the question and answer, which come up as anonymous, I'm afraid. What evidence is there now of the impact of the family cap on support for a 3rd or further child, generally and during the pandemic, especially on pushing more children into poverty? So I will go round and people can choose which of those questions they want to respond to. So Carl, I'll start with you.
I will probably take the question around, I don't know, on mitigations very quickly. I'll just say I think there's a risk the more complex you make the system, the more difficult it is for people to understand exactly what mitigations that they can avail themselves of. And that means it's more likely people to still fall foul of, you know, potentially quite serious cuts in their benefits. So I think I would prefer a simpler system that makes sure that people do get the entitlement they need, rather than, you know, take the benefit cap, for example. It's such a broad brush policy, and you know, it's almost inevitably going to end up making some households suffer that actually it's never the policy intent. I think that's the risk with very simple policies and, you know, relying on too many mitigations. On the question about the legacy benefits, I think I completely agree that we've become too focused, and it's probably going back over the last 20-30 years on thinking of the welfare system for working age as purely more of a safety net. And we see even before the crisis, the number of claims for contributory JSA was just dwindling further and further away, and that's probably because of the way the benefit system is treated in public discourse. And actually, yeah, there's a huge role that contributory-based benefits could play if they were, you know, properly uprated to reflect, you know, earnings more, as we, instead of seeing a long-term cut over the last 30 years compared to earnings, and B, actually, yeah, making them aligned with people's circumstances these days. Yeah, the contributory JSA system was a feature of the way the working world worked over 30-40 years ago, and quite frankly, things have just moved on since then. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Carl. Fazilet.
Thank you. I mean, it's a sort of comment as well as a kind of question. So Carl was sort of saying, you know, this with the public maybe having a bit of a better understanding of how inadequate the social security system is, and with the generosity question mark, you know, with the generosity of job retention and payments to self-employed people being so out of line with what people on social security are expected to live on. Is this the time to, you know, for someone to kind of lead the charge on a bit of a more fundamental change to the way we frame social security? Because it's, you know, of course we must, I mean, I completely agree with Joseph Rowntree focusing on a single issue of the lifeline, and I'm not a bit against those sort of single issue campaigns, but there's something like at the heart of the system that's completely wrong and unequal and immoral in a way. And I just wonder if there is any organisation that's leading on a more fundamental review of how it's delivered. I don't mean to sort of tinker about with all the processes necessarily, but just, I don't know, kind of put it on a different kind of platform.
And that's something that we're looking at doing next year with the Women's Budget Group, taking forward some of the recommendations from our Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which published at the end of September, where we made some specific recommendations, which will be very familiar to everybody, around the 2-child limit and the benefit cap and no recourse, and then talked about the need for a social security system based on a set of principles that we set out. And I think, the next job is to work with, as many partners as possible to do some more detailed work about what that would look like. But Lucy, I wanted to go to you next, and you may choose to answer other things, but I know that JRF has done quite a lot of work around framing and communicating around social security. So that might be something you wanted to say something about.
Definitely keen to pick up on those points, yes, but just firstly on the 2-child limit and the impact of that. Obviously, we know that large families are particularly at risk of poverty before the crisis, and we know that many families who would not have had any interaction with the social security system beforehand, who have had large families, will now be kind of hit with the 2-child limit, which of course will kind of really limit the amount of money that they're able to access. So that's had a huge impact as well. And yeah, just going back to the overall kind of attitude towards social security in our society, whilst we very much have, my focus has been particularly on this short-term campaign, one of the kind of things that we at JRF think we can really bring to the sector is a kind of a long-term focus on attitudes. And that's where our framing work has come in. So I think there's 3 kind of main elements here. One is public support for social security, and we do that through framing. So the way that we all talk about social security, we've mentioned a few words here, like not just being seen as the safety net. First of all, that's just something that catches you and you're full and you're there. And it's also just for emergencies. We want a social security system that's there for all of us throughout lives, our life's tides and waves. And just kind of changing that frame that people often kind of draw upon when we talk about social security is so crucial. And so we've got a lot of resources on our website which really set out the best way to talk about that. But then 2 other projects. One is bringing the public with us in the policies around social security. So people have mentioned a few things in the chat and from the panelists, like UBI, contributory based versus universal. What isn't necessarily clear is where there is public support for these things. So we've recently seen public support. The public has kind of shifted over the last few years from thinking the benefit levels were too high and caused people to benefit scroungers type kind of frame was very much in use, to now they overwhelmingly agree that they are too low and cause hardship. So that's been a shift, and that was even in 2019. So we expect that's even come further through the pandemic with more people interacting with it. So what we're hoping to do is do a big project where we're really going to try and understand where the public is with social security and poverty generally, and then from that work with the public to develop some solutions that there will be that kind of widespread public support for. And then finally, of course, the importance of developing solutions with people with lived experience, because that is so often forgotten about. And some of the many issues we talked about today could have been easily solved if someone who has ever been on social security had been involved in the decision-making process. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. Kim.
So 2 things in terms of the impact of the 2-child limit on families and income and poverty. When I was at the Runnymede Trust, we did a report with the Women's Budget Group, having a look at the changes to tax and benefits from 2010 onwards and the impact it had on people across different income levels, but also different ethnic minority groups. And we found that Bangladeshi and Pakistani families in particular, but also Black African families, because of the 2-child limit, but also freeze to working age benefits, had seen on the lowest incomes, had seen their incomes adversely affected in a much more disproportionate manner to, say, the wealthiest white men. And so we do know that that has had a huge impact. I don't know as much about during COVID, what that looks like. But I think we can safely assume that it will have a disproportionate impact. And in terms of looking at the social security system more holistically and more widely, and thinking about what kind of system would we build and what would it look like if we weren't trying to fix in the immediate term the issues that we have now. And looking forward, we have a project that one of my colleagues is running called Secure Futures for Children and Families, which is doing that and asking the questions, what kind of principles should underpin such a system, and if we could look more widely, what would that look like? And that is happening at the moment. And in terms of the project that I'm working on, that's looking at emergency support and local welfare assistance. And again, if we weren't looking to fix the system as it stands right now, what kind of system will be built in its place and what kind of principles should underpin that? So we are looking at that at the moment. My project's a 2-year project. We're testing whatever proposals we come up with a citizens jury, so we can see how they move forward with the public. So keep an eye out for all of that.
Thanks, Kim. And Fran.
Thanks, Marianne. I wanted to take the point that Marilyn had made about legacy benefits. She's absolutely right. These are not legacy benefits. These are benefits that that continue and are not going to be abandoned, we hope. And that is the contributory benefits of job seekers allowance and employment and support allowance, which for many people, as Fazilet was saying, has been cut by £30 a week for the work-related activity group, and we would want to see that restored. And also, of course, carers allowance, which initially, because it was non-contributory, is paid at a lower level, and most people think that should be increased. But I wanted to particularly focus on the idea about a quotes new beverage. At some point, people are going to stop referring to beverage when we're talking about revamping our social security system, but it hasn't happened yet. So there's lots and lots of work being done on this. This is not starting from scratch. And I would want to emphasize that whatever we talk about will probably be a balance between different principles in terms of the social security system, contributory on the one hand, non-contributory on the other, non-means tested on the one hand, means tested on the other. It's the balance that's the crucial issue. And at the moment, I would agree, I think, with what Carl was saying, which is we've got the balance too far in the means tested direction. So some people have been focusing on universal services rather than anything to do with benefits, like the New Economics Foundation. Unfortunately, that means they've come up with the idea of a guaranteed minimum income, which is a giant means tested system. But they are quite rightly drawing attention to the importance of universal services underlying a benefit system as well. Some people have been focusing on how people are treated and how they should be treated and the amount of benefit, and that's particularly the Commission on Social Security, which is led by experts by experience. So they've been focusing on those important elements of the system. As Kim was saying, CPAG has been using deliberative dialogue in particular to talk about secure futures for families and children, which also covered quite a few general principles of the social security system. And I would stress that I think deliberative dialogue is useful in terms of citizens' juries and so on, rather than just public opinion in terms of what do you agree with in a one phrase question. So there's lots and lots of work going on this. I think one of the things I realized recently, which I hadn't quite clocked before, was that, you know, we hear a lot of talk about universal basic income. Even if we introduced a universal basic income in the UK, my view is that it would be too low to be an adequate income for everybody, particularly, and I think Fazilet would agree, for people with disabilities, for example, for disabled people. And so whether we get a universal basic income at a level of £40 a week, £48 a week, whatever it might be, I think it will only be a partial basic income if it's ever introduced. That means we still have to talk about the principles by which the rest of the benefit system is going to work, because it won't be enough for any benefit for anybody by itself. And therefore, we still need to talk about how much should be contributory, how much should be means tested, how much should be non-contributory and non-means tested, how much should be individual, how much should be household, and so on. There's lots of work being done already. There's lots of things to think about, but I don't think we will be able to avoid all those debates just by introducing an element of universal basic income.
Thank you very much, Fran. We're coming to the end now, but there's a few questions which we may not have time to answer, but I wanted to flag up just so that people know that their points have been heard. So the first one was adult children are also returning home, having lost jobs and not wanting to live alone on social security. This relieves them of rent and other costs of living, but are they entitled to anything as a contribution to the family household? Well, actually, there's also the issue of the family household having a cut in the benefit level that they receive on the basis that they've got a non-dependent child living with them. Jerome has asked a question, what would be a good level for child benefit? We talk a lot about raising it. Some talk about £50 a week, but what would be a good level if we could raise it more? How should it be calculated as a percentage of average wages, average consumption costs of children, excluding childcare, and so on? And then there is, and Jackie Longworth has raised the question about universal basic income. What's the feeling about universal basic income? Hadi Turkman, I hope I pronounced that correctly. My question is about migrant workers and the benefit system. As we know, some migrants are not allowed to claim benefits due to visa regulations. Has there been any campaign to change this? And yes, there has. I mean, there's ongoing campaigning around lifting the no recourse to public funds rules, which Kim's just, no, Kim's putting something about the benefit cap, but I'm sure that Anna can put some links to the campaigns against no recourse to public funds. So there's lots of questions there. I'm not going to ask people to answer them all because we haven't got time. This has been a really, really interesting session. What I wanted to do was to give each of our panelists a chance to say one more sentence, and not a sentence with lots of subordinate clauses, a short sentence. So I'll start with Carl. One last thing.
So in one sentence, I'll just say that I think everyone has raised a whole suite of issues that need to be addressed. And that's the key thing for me, is that the welfare system needs to provide support for everyone. It is the support mechanism, and it needs to make sure that it gets all of these things right. It's not good enough just to throw £20 a week, although that is really important. It needs to make sure it fixes all these other problems as well.
Thank you. Fazilet.
I think, you know, people's lives are being put under such unfair pressure and disadvantage by the system. And it would be very good if we could find a way of talking about the system in a way that everyone could understand. I'm not a benefits expert, and I think, like me, a lot of other people just glaze over when the professionals start talking about the different elements. So I think we need to find a way of talking about change that people can join in with.
That's a really important point, actually. Lucy.
I think everyone's raised, you know, absolutely crucial issues that we'll all need to kind of shift our focus to very, very soon. And as you know, none of these are enough on their own. But I'll just use this time to just ask anyone who is interested in getting involved with the Keep the Lifeline campaign just to get in contact, as I said before. Great, thanks.
Kim, and thanks for posting the link to the No Recourse to Public Funds network as well.
Oh, no problem. I would end that. I am two things. We need to quality impact assess everything, and the social security system isn't exempt from that. But also that I'm feeling actually really positive. Maybe I'm getting too overexcited about the British Social Attitude Survey data. But over the past 10 years, campaigners have been really pushing that reducing spending is impacting families and telling that story and giving platforms to people to tell their story. And I think that the change in attitudes is a result of people's hard work in campaigning, and that is daunting and terrifying as the world seems at the moment. Our message is getting out there, and that we should carry on with that and keep putting it out there and be proud of that.
Brilliant, Kim. Thank you. Fran.
just to say that I think obviously the Women's Budget Group in particular focuses on gender and social security issues. And it's just amazing how many issues have been brought into the debate today from that initial focus that actually brings in all the wider issues about how our social security system should look like in the future, I think. So it's I think it's really a good starting point for a very good debate about the future of social security in the longer term.
Great. Thank you all very much for attending this event. It's been a really kind of intense hour. I'd really like to thank all of our panelists who both incredibly informed and, focused on so many different issues in such a short space of time, and the audience for taking part. As we said at the beginning, this is the first of a series of webinars, and there's more information about future ones on our website. You can sign up. We will also be posting a link to the recording of this webinar so that you can share it with those of your friends who are foolish enough to do something else on a Friday lunchtime other than watch a meeting on social security. So we hope to see many of you very soon. I think kind of finish with Kim's point, actually, that, these changes happen because people fight for them and campaign for them and research and produce evidence and organize platforms for people with lived experience. And there's a whole range of different ways, and do the work that Lucy's talking about, thinking about how best to frame our arguments. Positive and negative changes are not inevitable. They're results, and positive change is a result of hard work of large numbers of people. And it's, it's really great to be with this panel who've all been working in different ways on this, and with many of you in the audience who I also know have. So thank you all very much. Have a really good weekend. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.